My name is Jonathan Anderson. I'm Associate Professor of Art here at Biola University. And it's my great pleasure to have a conversation today with Dan Siedell, author, curator, art historian, critic, presidential scholar, an art historian in residence at the King's College in New York City, and most recently the author of a book called Who's Afraid of Modern Art? Essays on Modern Art and Theology in Conversation. And we'll kick off, I'm interested in that subtitle especially, Essays on Modern Art and Theology in Conversation. There's so many different ways to form a conversation between those two. They often vie for priority over one another, and it's that conversation can be positioned in different places. It takes a different shape when it's in a seminary or in an art gallery or in an art museum. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about those two in conversation? How does the conversation get started for you?
Sure. I love Jesus and I love Jackson Pollock, and I've been trying to figure out how they interact and interrelate. And so this collection of essays are ways for me to think theologically about modern and contemporary art in a way that helps me understand modern and contemporary art. So oftentimes thinking theologically about art will mean theology comes into art, comes to it, explains it, sorts it out, makes it operate in a way that polishes the theology. And then theology goes on and is applied as a model to explaining other works of art. And what I was interested in was enlisting theology into the service of understanding art and understanding artistic practice. And so it meant that theology was operating in a little more spontaneous, ad hoc, informal, but I find ultimately flexible way of trying to deepen the experience of art. So it's theological thinking in the service of art rather than art serving to illustrate or to polish a particular theological perspective.
And would you distinguish that from theology of art, that the theology of art would be starting with certain theological kind of premises and then you move towards art?
Right, there's a certain presumption if you get your theological ducks in a row, then the details of cultural artifacts and works of art will just take care of themselves. And what I was interested in, it was starting with the particular relationship of the person who stands before a work of art, and then thinking theologically about what happens when that person stands before the work of art.
And do you feel like those bringing theology into that encounter with the work is necessary? The
perception can be that this is professional theology, it's systematic theology, it's something that's imposed from the outside, so that there's the messiness of artistic practice, the messiness of experiencing art and the varying interpretations, etc. And then theology is the objective sorter outer, I guess, and categorizer. And so you get those objective categories, those abstract categories set up, and then you don't really, then the works of art they just get fit in there. Yeah. And so what I was interested in doing was thinking more existentially about theology, so that theology wasn't something that professional theologians do in the seminary, but that every human being who stands before God and neighbor is acting theologically. And so what I'm interested in is thinking about that encounter that the person has before a work of art, where they stand before a work of art that addresses them, as that experience is a theological experience, or an experience that can be illuminated, deepened, and expanded through theological reflection that helps understand that experience, not turns that experience into a tool for thinking about theology, but for theology to help us understand what it means to have relationships with works of art.
Mm-hmm. And it's in the address. You are addressed, and that is a theologically charged situation, right, is what you want to
Right, and in my essays come out of my engagement with Luther's thought. And so that becomes really a guiding focus for me in terms of Luther's emphasis on the human being who stands before God, coram Deo, and stands before the world, coram mundi, and how that work of art, a painting, for example, activates that. And in the history of modern artistic practice, artists are going into the studio making work in a way that is nakedly existential, in that they're asking questions of who am I? They're asking the Augustinian questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? And what's the value of the work that I do? And where am I going? And those works of art are means by which that they're working that out. So there's an interesting, for me, in the modern artistic tradition, there's an interesting blend of theology and the arts, in which art is not just painting theology. Say in classical or Renaissance academic painting, the painter is painting theological subjects or biblical subjects. The modern artist is going to the studio, and that practice itself is a theological practice, or a practice that was understood in many ways as a religious practice. They're trying to find order, they're trying to find truth, they're trying to find meaning, and they're presuming that the viewer also is on that same search for truth, and that work is doing something to them. And what I also wanted to emphasize in the book is my response to these works, so that I'm not operating as an objective commentator without any emotional skin in the game. These are works and experiences that I'm having, and I'm reflecting on those experiences as a painting by Cézanne or a painting by Munch or Jackson Pollock is having an effect on me, and that effect is something that happens first, so that I'm addressed first by that work, and then my response is the writing, or my response is how I will begin to understand that experience.
Mm-hmm. And that is a response in some ways under the face of God, or before the face of God. So, and that's yeah.
No, there's an aspect of it in which Luther understands is that we stand before God passively, receptively. We stand in the dative case. So we are responded. We are not the agent. We are responding to. The work that we do is a response to that initial encounter. And so what I'm interested in is not just going to a painting in a museum or a gallery, an artist studio, and coming in and interpreting it, coming in aggressively, presuming it to be a static thing that needs my explanation. I'm approaching it in the way of being addressed first by the work. So that the work is doing something first. So there's a certain kind of passivity or receptivity. And then the response, the active response, is cognition, consciousness, reflection, thinking about it. And then the writing itself becomes part of my active response as I'm working through what it means for me to be addressed by that painting or addressed by that work of art.
And that's what strikes me as so valuable about what you're doing, and the work you're doing, is that you're locating the theological activity in the act of art criticism, in the act of having an encounter, coming to grips with what is this thing that is addressing me and that I am addressing. That's where the where you're groping for theological lines of questioning, or it is appearing to you as a theological line
theological
of
thinking is something that I do as a way to understand my relationship with cultural objects, with artistic artifacts. And so theological thinking, however, can very easily, like philosophical thinking or any critical theory or anything, can quickly harden and become the model that is what the focus is. The focus then is how to do art in a particular theological context. But I want to hold the theological approach with pretty light touch, and to be able to do it in a way that is actually not just serving the art and the artist, but serving those that have relationships with works of art outside the church. And I sincerely believe that theological thinking is a very productive way of thinking about, reflecting on, and exploring what happens when we stand before a work of art, and what happens when we live with works of art over the course of our lives. But I don't want I don't want it to be signaled as, oh, here's a theologian who's doing theological work on art. I'm a human being with a broken heart and trying to figure out what it means to be who I am and a child of God in this broken world, and thinking about that relationship as every human being stands before God or a judge or somebody to whom they must give an account, and their neighbor and their world. That matrix is a way for me to understand more deeply what is happening for me in that relationship. But ultimately what I want it to be able to do is to serve artists outside the church, serve others who stand before the work and know that something is happening significantly that is compelling their attention, but perhaps the language in the art world, the critical language in the art world, is just not sufficient and not rich enough. I mean, one of the things that theological language, thinking theologically, has always brought with it is the fact that the theologian who's doing the theological thinking has skin in the game. It's not an objective thing in which he or she is looking at a distance. This is an act of trying to understand God and know God, and to try to live in the light of His presence, and to do so in culture. And so that's an aspect of what I want to do. In a certain way, it's kind of a Kierkegaardian indirect way of thinking theologically, in which the goal is art, not theology, and so the theology interweaves in a particular way. My hope is that it interweaves in a particular way that deepens the emotional impact of reading an account of a person who has relationships with these works of art.
And it strikes me that if the theological activity or questioning, it comes in as a sort of ad hoc, responsive, means of trying to deal with the address of the artwork to you. I'm interested. I mean, that's a very improvisational kind of ad hoc activity. How that in some ways needs to be just responsive, stand in front of the work, and it will raise the questions that need to be raised. But in another sense, you're prepared for it in a way. I mean, for instance, you're well prepared with Luther. Luther is there with you and talking with you, and Kierkegaard and whoever else. Can you talk a bit about that sort of how you think of your own kind of preparation as you go into that responsive critical activity?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do in these essays was to give an account of how a particular person, is using the resources and the passions and say the intellectual tools and resources that he has at his disposal in order to make sense of what is happening, how he understands a relationship with works of art, that I'm hoping is not restrictive in saying that this is the best possible way to interpret. This is how I do it. What I'm hoping is that what that does is empowering people to be able to bring what other resources they have. It may not be theological resources, or maybe theological resources with a different inflection, but to bring those resources to bear on experiencing works of art, and to do so in a way that is in the service of that work and the experience of that person's understanding of that work. And so the aspect that I want to preserve, or in terms of preparation, what I want to be able to accomplish for the reader is the reader reads this, and the reader has an imagination that's prepared to be addressed by a work of art in a way. They don't need to use my theological apparatus as a guide, as some sort of brochure that leads them through the work of art. I just want them to anticipate having an experience and knowing that they will be addressed in a particular way, and to be open and receptive to that. And then part of the training and part of the practice of looking at art is the combination of education, of say learning the history of art, the history of artistic practice, continual education in that respect, and then also just recognition of the tools that you can bring to experiencing works of art. Oftentimes tools that we don't really think they're at our disposal, in the sense that what we bring to a work of art, we don't really think that that's intellectual enough or that's sophisticated enough. It has to just be a certain kind of education. Teach me, teach me. And what I'm wanting to be able to do is to empower the reader to, first and foremost, allow the work of art to address them as an aesthetic object where they're at. And my hope is that that ignites an imagination, that gets them interested in exploring modern artistic practice and gets them out into the galleries and museums.
And that seems like a perfect charge to end on.
Thank you very much.
Dan, thanks so much for being here.
It is my pleasure. My pleasure, Jonathan.
Likewise.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.